Today, we're working directly from excerpts from Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs.
That's right. So our mission here is, well, it's to unpack these specific pieces of text. We want to look at the key moments, the people, the relationships, and, personality traits that come through directly in this material.
We'll walk you through what jumps out from these pages, pull out some maybe surprising details, and give some perspective on what this text specifically shows us about him.
Okay, so let's just dive into the raw material itself, see what stories pop out. Let's unpack this.
Okay, so starting right at the beginning, his early life really shed light on his adoption by Paul and Clara Jobs. It mentions that the first couple actually backed out.
Right, because they wanted a girl. It's quite a twist, really.
It is. And so, Steve ends up with Paul, a high school dropout mechanic, and Clara, a bookkeeper. And the text really highlights how strongly he felt about them.
Yeah, he hated it when people called them adoptive parents. The quote in the text is, "They were my parents 1,000%.
Exactly. And he had that very blunt take on his biological parents, too, calling them just a sperm and egg bank. It's stark language right there in the source.
Definitely. And that relationship with Paul Jobs seems foundational based on these pages. The text describes Paul setting up that workbench for him in the garage, teaching him craftsmanship.
Yeah, Steve apparently remembered being really impressed by his dad's attention to detail, like even how the back of a fence was built, the parts no one would see.
That focus on the making of things, on quality even where it's hidden, that feels like a core principle you can trace right back to these early descriptions in the text.
Absolutely. The text also mentions his early sort of tinkering, going from pranks to actual electronics, even wiring up speakers to listen in on rooms.
A little preview of wanting control, maybe.
Could be. And his dad's influence, the text says, connected him to Larry Lang, the engineer down the street.
Oh, right. Lang gave him that carbon microphone and introduced him to Heathkits.
Exactly. And Jobs recalled, according to the source, how Heathkits didn't just give you parts, they explained the theory. Made you feel like you could build and understand anything.
That feeling, I can build anything, that must have been huge. A key takeaway from these early life excerpts.
Definitely. Now, shifting gears a bit, the sources you provided also talk about his dive into the counterculture.
Yeah, his shared love of music with Wozniak, especially Bob Dylan. The text mentions them hunting down bootlegs.
Which is, another little hint of operating outside the usual channels, isn't it? Right there in the description.
Totally. And that spirit seems to blend with the tech side in the Blue Box story. Wozniak designs a digital version.
And the text quotes Woz saying how proud he was of that circuit. They try it, it works, and Woz shouts, "Hi, we're calling you for free."
That mix of, technical genius and slightly rebellious fun, it really comes across in how the text describes it.
It does. Then there's the deep dive into Eastern spirituality, Zen Buddhism specifically. Friends like Kotke apparently saw it baked into his personality.
Right, influencing his stark minimalist aesthetics and intense focus, as the text puts it. He also talked about intuition being more important than just logic.
But the text also points out a kind of paradox, doesn't it? His intensity made achieving that inner peace difficult.
Yes, his Zen awareness didn't really come with, calm or mellowness. It seems the source is suggesting a conflict there between his drive and the ideals.
And this connects to Robert Friedland at Reed College. The text describes Friedland as this intense figure, also into Eastern spirituality. Jobs was apparently captivated.
And they traveled to India together, right? To find Maharaji, Baba Ram Das's guru. The text details this journey.
It does, with some really revealing details. Holmes, another friend, recalled making these vegetarian feasts. And the source includes this stark description of Steve starving, stuffing himself, and then purging.
Wow. Holmes thought he was bulimic, the text says. That offers a glimpse, as presented here, into something complex about control, maybe self-image, even back then.
Yeah, it's quite raw. And the text notes Jobs eventually soured on Friedland's cult leader style.
Yeah.
And the commune becoming materialistic.
There's that quote in the source where Jobs saw too much of Friedland in himself, finding it strange that one of his early spiritual people turned out to be, symbolically, a gold miner. That hits hard, reading it in the text.
It really does. It speaks volumes about disillusionment. Okay, moving into his early career, the sources note he got bored with regular college classes pretty fast.
Preferred auditing things like dance class, right? Wozniak was apparently surprised he'd just skip required courses.
Yeah, the text uses that to show a difference in their approach. Even then, Jobs was already kind of charting his own path.
His time at Atari comes up, too. Charming the boss, Nolan Bushnell, The text says they discussed free will versus determinism.
Which apparently resonated with Jobs' belief in, sort of, bending reality. And the text notes he liked the simplicity of Atari games and Bushnell's willingness to play by his own rules. That rubbed off.
He also met Ron Wayne there. Wayne had started companies before.
And Jobs was fascinated, according to the source, proposed they go into business. Wayne turned down the slot machine idea, but the text notes he still saw Jobs' burning drive.
Then the India trip. The description of the source sounds intense. 7 months gone, shaved head, robes.
Yeah, the text notes his skin was deep, chocolate brown red. And there's that detail about him giving Kotke all his money when Kotke's traveler's checks were stolen. Shows a different side.
It does. The source presents that whole late 60s, early 70s Bay Area scene as this unique mix, doesn't it? Tech, hackers, counterculture, self-fulfillment.
Exactly. And the Homebrew Computer Club seems to be where it all kind of converged. Wozniak's computer was the star.
And Jobs started going with him. The text mentions Lee Felsenstein, presiding another figure embodying that tech counterculture blend.
And Jobs, impressed by Woz's work, started helping source components. The text specifically mentions him getting Intel chips for free because he knew how to talk to sales reps.
Something Wozniak felt too shy to do, the source says. Shows that business savvy emerging early on, right from these descriptions.
Definitely. And that's where Ron Wayne comes back in. Jobs needed someone to manage Wozniak a bit, mediate things.
And the text describes Wayne convincing Woz that the designs needed to belong to the Apple partnership, arguing a great engineer needs a great marketer.
And Jobs was so grateful. According to the source, he offered Wayne 10% of the company.
Then enters Mike Markkula, the venture capitalist.
Yeah, the text paints a picture, shows up in a gold Corvette, cautious but smart, sees the Apple II prototype, looks past the haircuts, and is amazed.
The source says Markkula became like a father figure, taught Jobs marketing, sales. There's that quote the text includes from Jobs recalling Markkula's advice. Never start a company to get rich. Your goal should be making something you believe in.
And making a company that will last. That principle, drawn straight from the text here, seems really formative for Jobs' early business thinking.
So Apple Computer Co. is officially born January 77. And the text notes Jobs was absolutely convinced the Apple II would be huge, even though hardly any hobbyist had one yet.
And this is where the excerpts really start digging into his personality and management style. That obsession for product perfection.
Right. The text cites conflicts, like agonizing over shades of beige for the Apple II case, or how rounded the corners should be.
Or insisting on white engineering benches. The source shows this clashing with pragmatists like Mike Scott.
The warranty dispute is another example the text gives. Scott was flabbergasted. Jobs wanted a year, not 90 days.
And the source mentions Jobs sometimes dissolving into tears during arguments. Adds another layer to that intensity.
The text also notes Wozniak rankled at Jobs' style. Felt he was too tough, wanted the company to feel more like a family.
While Jobs, in turn, apparently felt Wozniak was too childlike, maybe unfocused. The sources really highlight that tension between them.
And the text includes that famous Regis McKenna quote, Wozniak has designed a great machine, but he would be sitting in hobby shops today were it not for Steve Jobs.
The source uses that to underscore Jobs' crucial role and suggests that fueled his desire for his own machine, which leads, of course, to the Macintosh.
Before the Mac, though, the sources briefly touch on his relationship with Chris and Brennan, kind of on again, off again, including at Friedland's farm.
Yes, and the text directly mentions their daughter, Lisa Brennan Jobs. It notes layers of resentment and her being pretty much abandoned by him for her first 10 years.
Though the text also says he later regretted not being a better dad when she was 5, it paints a complicated picture based on these passages.
Definitely complicated. So moving to the next big thing. The Apple II success makes Jobs want something more, something to make a dent in the universe, as the text puts it.
Which leads to the visit to Xerox PARC. Alan Kay's maxim, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. Apparently really hit home, according to the source.
And that visit happened because of a deal, right? Xerox invests $1 million in Apple. Apple gets to see their tech.
Yeah, and the text quotes Adele Goldberg, one of the Xeron scientists, calling the deal incredibly stupid, completely nuts.
Because Jobs and his team saw the graphical interface, the desktop metaphor, the mouse. The text pretty clearly implies Apple got the better end of that deal, gaining priceless insights. Pivotal moment, as described here.
Then we hear about Jeff Raskin starting the Macintosh project.
Until Jobs takes over. The text has that famous scene. Jobs yanking Andy Hertzfeld's Apple II power cord, moving him to the Mac team, declaring the Apple II is dead, the Mac is the future.
That kind of dramatic, almost theatrical move, it's detailed right there in the source.
And his recruiting for the Mac team, as presented in the text, was all about passion. He'd show the prototype, watch their eyes light up, wanted that wow reaction.
It wasn't just about skills, the text suggests, but that connection to the vision.
And the sources elaborate on his reality distortion field. Wozniak's description is in the text having an illogical vision that he somehow makes true.
Debbie Coleman, also quoted in the source, compared him to Rasputin, when people got sort of pulled into his orbit.
And his demanding nature, the text links it directly to his perfectionism, his impatience with anything less. The Adam Osborne anecdote is used as a contrast.
Right, Osborne saying adequacy is sufficient, and Jobs railing, according to the text, he's not making art, he's making shit.
The text quotes Coleman saying his insults were almost hourly occurrences, yet she also felt like the luckiest person to work with him. That complexity, the harshness alongside the inspiration, is a key insight drawn straight from these accounts.
His design philosophy gets a lot of attention in these excerpts, too. Influences like Eichler homes, his dad's focus on car details.
He believed great industrial design set Apple apart. Hart met Esslinger from Frog Design, bringing that California global look. Form follows emotion, as the text puts it.
And the source details his obsession down to the calculator app design that apparently shipped and lasted 15 years.
Knowing he wasn't quite ready to run the whole show, the text describes the search for an outside CEO. Don Estridge at IBM was a top choice.
Described in the text as driven, inspiring, but also able to let others think his ideas were theirs, Jobs offered him a huge package, the text says.
But Estridge, described as more Navy rather than a pirate, turned him down, which led to John Scully.
The sources describe Scully's kids being totally starstruck by Jobs. Scully himself was surprised by Apple's casual vibe.
And the text says Jobs just clicked into evangelical mode over lunch, wanting to change the way people use computers.
The courtship is described as maybe somewhat unhealthy. Scully seeing qualities in Jobs he admired in himself. It was intense.
But that initial intensity cooled, according to the text. Scully started recoiling at Jobs' rudeness, described him throwing code back at engineers.
And the text quotes Jobs justifying it. I know they can do better. Scully tried coaching him, but felt, as the text says, it was not in his nature to filter his feelings.
Then the Macintosh launch, described in the source as pure theater, the 1984 ad.
Based on Orwell's novel, yeah. The text describes it as this 60-second ad that would look like a scene from a sci-fi movie. Became a sensation, later called the greatest commercial ever, the text notes.
The sources present Jobs becoming this grand master of product launches, using publicity, manipulating journalists.
And the text quotes him scoffing at market research before the Mac launch, asking, did Alexander Graham Bell do any market research before he invented the telephone? Classic Jobs is depicted here.
The launch itself is described so vividly in the source. Pandemonium, frenzy, Jobs choking up, a 5-minute ovation.
And the text says he gave each team member a personalized Mac, acknowledged the tough ride, his rough style, but also asserted he was the one who could pull it off. It's a moment of both acknowledgement and self-assertion right there in the text.
His relationship with Bill Gates gets touched on too. Hertzfeld is quoted in the source saying each thought he was smarter than the other.
The text describes Jobs treating Gates as, like, inferior in taste, while Gates looked down on Jobs for not programming.
Gates found Jobs fundamentally odd and weirdly flawed, put off by the rudeness, the text says. Jobs, meanwhile, found Gates unnervingly narrow, calling him unimaginative, a rip-off artist.
The text presents it as this fascinating rivalry, disdain, but also maybe some grudging respect underneath.
Seems like it. Then the conflict with Scully boils over, leading to Jobs being pushed out. The text describes Jobs making calls, telling some people he lacked confidence in Scully, then telling Scully he was terrific.
That detail from the source seems to highlight a manipulative aspect, doesn't it?
It does. At the board meeting, Scully issues an ultimatum. Board sides with him, unanimously. Jobs waits outside, knows he's lost, hugs a colleague.
And the text describes Scully presenting the new structure. Jobs in this tiny box labeled Chairman and Global Visionary. Awkward applause.
Jobs' reaction, as described in these excerpts, was deep. Stayed home, blinds drawn, playing Dylan. The times they are a-changin'.
The text quotes him feeling like I'd been punched, the air knocked out of me.
And his friend George Riley, according to the text, connected it back to that deep feeling of being rejected at an early age.
The source notes he felt he lost father figures in Scully, Markula, Arthur Rock, recalling Rock choosing Scully over him, tearing up about it in the text.
So then comes next T. He tells the board his plan, promises not to compete, takes only a few non-key people.
But Wozniak tells Time magazine, according to the source, that he couldn't trust Jobs' integrity. Reveals Jobs tried to recruit him and blocked frog design from an Apple project. That public friction is right there in the text.
Challenges at Next T, as described in the source, included insisting on custom chips, building a futuristic factory, kind of repeating the obsessive details from the Mac factory build.
Yeah, the text uses the example of painting robots certain colors and arranging the assembly line for better visitor viewing. That focus on presentation was still absolutely central.
His time at Pixar is also covered in these excerpts. The text notes clashes, like with Ed Smith, who saw Jobs' charisma leading to abuse of power.
But the source also highlights that many colleagues, even after feeling abused, ended up saying he pushed them to do things they never dreamed possible.
At Pixar, the text suggests maybe he learned a bit more to let other creatives, like John Lasseter, flourish, perhaps adapting his style somewhat, as presented here.
His main role there became deal-making, the text says. It recounts that clash with Jeffrey Katzenberg over A Bug's Life. Jobs accusing Katzenberg of stealing Lasseter's idea for ants.
That detail from the sources shows how fierce he could be protecting creative vision.
Back in his personal life, the search for his biological mother is mentioned.
Yeah, the text says he held back, telling Paul and Clara out of sensitivity, waited until after Clara died to contact Joanne Simpson.
Then met his biological sister, Mona Simpson. Initially avoided her novel, but later admitted, the text says, that maybe 25% was totally me. A cautious approach to that part of his past, it seems, from the source.
His relationships get more exploration. Tina Redsea, this spiritual connection, the text calls it, pining for her even after marriage, tearing up when recalling her.
Then Laureen Powell. The text includes this kind of matchmaker sketch of the ideal woman for him, tough yet zen, independent but accommodating.
Their home life is described in the text as surprisingly unassuming. The woodside house, minimally furnished for years, philosophical debates about sofas.
The text contrasts this with Bill Gates being apparently baffled by the simplicity. And there's that sad detail presented in the source about Burl Smith's mental health struggles throwing rocks at their house.
Despite the wealth, the text quotes Jobs saying Buddhism taught him material possessions often just cluttered life. He avoided flashy displays.
The text notes his kids called Larry Ellison our rich friend, which kind of highlights that perspective.
Then his return to Apple. Initiated by Nextfee reaching out, Gil Amelio chose Jobs over another candidate.
And the text notes, Jobs was impressed by Emilio's Mercedes. The negotiation was quick. Jobs was pleasantly surprised. Emilio offered $10 a share, not $12 for Nextfee, and just took it.
The source presents it as almost anticlimactic for such a huge moment.
He came back as a part-time advisor, but quickly became central. The text notes his initial passivity, feeling offended he wasn't asked to join the board right away.
Then pushed hard to kill products he didn't like the Newton Scully's pet project, he called it in the text, hating the stylus. That ruthless pruning is detailed as a key early move in the source.
The text also explains his hesitation about becoming permanent CEO after Emilio left. He was happy at Pixar, felt torn.
Until he called Andy Grove, the source recounts, and Grove famously said, "Steve, I don't give a shit about Apple."
And that's when Jobs realized, according to the text, I do give a shit about Apple. That moment, as described, was the turning point.
Reviving Apple meant the Think Different campaign, focusing on creativity, reminding people of their heroes. The text describes Jobs holding weekly marketing meetings, okaying every ad.
Even used rivals like Michael Dell to rally the troops, the text says.
And he just slashed the product line, forced teams to justify their existence. The source mentions him banning PowerPoint from meetings.
People who know what they're talking about don't need PowerPoint, the text quotes him saying. This focus, detailed right here, saved the company, led to profitability.
His collaboration with Joni Ive is really highlighted. The text says, I was planning to quit but got inspired when Jobs stated Apple's goal wasn't just money, but great products.
Their bond, as described in the source, led to the iMac and everything after.
His intensity was still there, though. That fucking dickless asshole's comment to a chip supplier who then made Team FDA jackets.
Huh. Yeah, the text notes that. It also says he ran operations himself for a year until hiring Tim Cook, described as indispensable.
Cook, according to the source, wasn't fazed by Jobs' tantrums, seeing them as passion.
The text notes Jobs' prickliness hadn't totally vanished, citing the handicapped parking habit. But the source also points out people could challenge him if they were ready for the blowback, and sometimes he respected that. That nuance is presented in these anecdotes.
He resisted being permanent CEO for years, took $1 a year salary initially. The text mentions the backdated stock options issue, noting the board found irregularities, but states Jobs didn't personally profit financially, according to the information presented here.
OS X, based on NXT software, is presented as absolutely essential. The text describes adapting it for compatibility, and the Apple Store's a key part of his vision.
Larry Ellison visiting the warehouse mock-ups. The text uses that to highlight Jobs' obsession with every detail. Aesthetics, checkout process, described as beauty as simplicity, an exact, explicit recipe.
His desire for end-to-end control is explicitly mentioned in the sources. The text links this to banning Adobe Flash on the iPad.
And that lesson learned from a past Adobe issue. We shouldn't get into any business where we didn't control both the hardware and the software. This principle, as described, drove huge decisions.
Which led to Apple making its own application software, the whole digital hub idea.
Yeah.
Seeing the PC becoming something else, connecting devices, leading to the iPod.
The iPod came from his love of music. The text describes him meeting Doug Morris at Universal Music. Morris was impressed by Jobs' complete system, vision, the store, the software, the player.
Yeah, the source notes the music companies just didn't have that technical vision themselves.
The text uses Sony as a counterexample, failing to create that end-to-end service because of internal silos, and it presents Jobs' business rule. If you don't cannibalize yourself, someone else will.
That rule, drawn from the source, explains a lot of Apple's bold moves, doesn't it?
It really does. Then the iPhone design. The text describes him hitting pause even when it was nearly done, realizing, I just don't love it.
Which led to revisions with Ive. And that Corning Gorilla Glass story highlights his demanding belief in pushing limits. The text quotes him, "Don't be afraid, you can do it."
The sources also cover his cancer diagnosis in 2003, his initial resistance to surgery for 9 months. The text links it to the dark side of his reality distortion field, filtering out bad news.
He eventually had the surgery and later a liver transplant. The text describes him discussing his health with friends, advisors.
His medical leaves are mentioned, Tim Cook stepping in, processing Jobs' outbursts as passion, proving steady, though the text notes Jobs still saw him as not a product person per se.
The iPad's development is detailed too. Started with that netbook idea, Ive suggesting a multi-touch screen keyboard instead.
Making 20 different models. The text describes Jobs pushing for absolute simplicity, making the screen the hero.
The sources discuss his content strategy too, using that Aikido move to get the agency model for books different from music.
Meeting with journalism execs, wanting to help quality journalism. But the text notes he was blunt, telling them NYC Tech was way behind Silicon Valley.
That whole debate with Google over closed versus open systems is presented. Eric Schmidt laying out Google's view open means more choice.
Contrasted with Apple's controlled approach, the text includes Jobs citing a moral responsibility to keep porn off the iPhone, and Ryan Tate's challenge. Revolutions are about freedom. Really highlights that philosophical clash as presented in the sources.
And AntennaGate for the iPhone 4. The text describes Jobs shifting the narrative. Michael Wolff, quoted in the text, calling him a grand master of crisis management, using his status to define what mattered, shows his power over perception, as detailed right here.
His later family life gets a mention, deeply wanting to see his son Reed graduate, a strong bond there.
Relationships with his daughters portrayed as maybe a bit more distant in the text. It notes Lisa Brennan Jobs reconnected during his final illness, reflecting on their difficult past, the early abandonment, her resentment as described in the sources.
And finally, the vision for the new Apple campus. Buying the old HP land where Wozniak first worked on the Apple I and II that appealed to him, building something lasting.
And the design obsession continued right to the end, didn't it? The shape changing after Reed's comment, the curved glass, planting apricot orchards. The text shows that detailed vision never stopped.
Isaacson's final take in these excerpts notes that Jobs' nasty edge hindered him more than it helped, but it also pushed people to achieve incredible things.
Yeah, he wasn't necessarily the inventor of everything, the text suggests, but a master combiner. Ideas, art, tech, surpassing companies like Xerox and Sony, as the text concludes, by being good at both the big vision and the tiny details.
Absolutely. This dive into just these specific text excerpts you shared really paints a picture. Complex, demanding, visionary, often contradictory, but the insights come straight from the source material provided.
So think about what stands out to you from these specific accounts we've discussed. What can you maybe learn about innovation or leadership or even just tackling challenges by looking closely at the details provided right here in this text?
Yeah, the source material offers these fascinating glimpses, doesn't it? How that vision and that, well, challenging personality intersected to really try and make a dent in the universe.
Consider how much of his success and his impact on others, both good and bad, was tied not just to what he created, but to how he drove people and saw the world as it's described right here in these pages. What does that dynamic suggest about the forces that shape things around us? Definitely something to think about.